Welcome back. This is part 4 of Manifest Destiny, America Goes West. Last time we talked about the Mexican Cession and how it became part of the U.S. and that new Whig Party. This time we're going to identify that state that was named after a typo. You may or may not be surprised at which one it is. So, grab your rake and your favorite fertilizer. We're going to plant some seeds of knowledge in our garden of learning. Oh no, a weed. I'll get it. Oh, my back.
Let's start today's lesson by taking a moment to look back at the different territories America took control of as it spread westward and how it got each one with rapid rewind review. First of all, in our last unit we talked about the Louisiana Purchase and how France sold it to America for $15 million to finance its quest to take over the world for only 3 cents an acre, which was a pretty good deal and gave America control of the port of New Orleans, which is all it really wanted anyway. Oh yeah, Mardi Gras! You gotta love New Orleans. After that we talked about Texans wanting to become part of the U.S. and how some people didn't like that idea. That couldn't happen until Texas declared its independence and fought for it at the Alamo, and eventually forced Santa Anna to sign a peace agreement. It all worked out in the end when Texas joined the Union as the 28th state. We then discussed the Mexican Cession and how it was added as a result of the Mexican-American War. You remember how old Fuss and Feathers took control of Mexico City to end the war and get the Mexican Cession for $15 million? That's almost cooler than James K. Polk's mullet. And lastly, we talked about the Gadsden Purchase, which was a small piece of land with a big price tag of $10 million, named after a, really cool guy, yeah. We needed to complete a railroad line through the southwest states of America, which would be the shortest and easiest route. Well, after that, we only have one territory left to discuss, which happens to be the one we live in. Before we get to that, however, we have a pretty big topic to discuss, the Native Americans. You see, one of the things America had to do to spread westward wasn't just gain territories through treaties and purchases, but also through the bloodshed of the people that first inhabited it. When we discuss American history, we cannot avoid the topic of Native Americans, and how they were systematically removed from the land or killed. At several different times during America's history, Native Americans were fought with, massacred, and negotiated with. George Washington believed that Native Americans were equal to whites as people, but that their culture was inferior. His policy was to allow Native Americans to keep their land if they were willing to adopt American culture, which meant converting to Christianity, building homes, farming, writing down their language, and sending kids to school. In the Southeast, some tribes, 5 specifically, agreed to voluntarily give up their culture if they could keep their land. These tribes were the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. They were able to keep their original lands until Andrew Jackson, president and hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, changed U.S. policy by signing the controversial Indian Removal Act. This act gave the president the power to negotiate the removal of all tribes on the east side of the Mississippi to Oklahoma. The first tribe removed was the Choctaw. They agreed to move and were promised food and transport to their new lands in Oklahoma. After the first group of Choctaw were removed, a chief of the Choctaw is quoted as saying that the trail was a, quote, trail of tears and death, unquote. The remaining tribes were dealt with in much the same way, with the most famous being the Cherokee Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Agreement was made with the small group of Cherokees who were not the leaders of the tribe. The Cherokee tribe appealed to the U.S. court system to find justice. The Supreme Court ruled that the tribe could not be forcibly removed by the state of Georgia, as according to previous treaties, they had no right to be on Cherokee land, much less use force to remove the tribe. Andrew Jackson, as president, was in charge of enforcing the court's decision. He, however, chose not to and allowed the state of Georgia to do what it wanted without consequence. In reality, he was violating the Constitution and therefore breaking the law. Without federal protection, the Cherokee were forced to march from their homelands in Georgia to Oklahoma, with over 4,000 people dying on the way, mostly the sick, the elderly, and children. Over time, all the tribes, those considered quote-unquote civilized, and those who were not, would be relocated to the west. Next, we reveal which state was named after a typo in our Modern Mysteries segment. Today we know the state is Oregon, but the origin of the name Oregon is not known for sure. The mystery comes from the fact that there is no known Native American tribe or word that sounds like Oregon. However, one theory is that the natives of the Southwest referred to the Columbia River as Oregon. Another theory is that Oregon is also a French word meaning windstorm. Anyone who has visited the Columbia River Gorge would agree that windstorm would be a good description. The most plausible theory is a map that was made in 1795 that labels the Columbia River Oregon. Over time it is thought that Oregon morphed into Oregon that we know today. Well, there you have it, a modern mystery with no solid answers. So how did Oregon become part of the U.S.? Well, at the time, Oregon country consisted of the modern states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and an area into Canada. At that time, Oregon country was jointly occupied by Britain and America. Both had settlers and claims to the area. The British even had a fort, Fort Vancouver, that they controlled. As more and more Americans came across the plains on the Oregon Trail, the number of Americans started to outnumber the British settlers. Some people in Oregon started to suggest that joint ownership should end. The question was, how should it end, and who should get the land? At the time, James K. Polk, aka Mr. Mullet, was running for president and ran on the slogan, 5440 or fight. 5440 was the line of latitude at the north end of Oregon Country, and the slogan meant that if all of Oregon Country didn't become part of the U.S., they would fight for it. After Polk won the election, he negotiated a compromise that split the territory at the 49th parallel. After the negotiations were complete, Oregon Country would be split, and the United States portion would eventually become Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. So what? After watching this video, you should be able to answer the following questions. Who are the 5 civilized tribes, and what did it mean to be one? What was the Indian Removal Act, and what were its effects? And finally, how did Oregon Country become part of the United States? If you got all those questions answered, then you'll learn what you needed to learn. Tune in next time when we go over our unit questions for the Civil War.